For the second topic of the semester, we'll see how human beings throughout prehistory have increased the complexity of their subsistence patterns and their power, their political systems. So here, this is classic anthropology, and we will go back in time. We'll see in parallel different modes of subsistence and levels of political organizations in the world today, and different modes of subsistence and political organizations in the past, to see how one turned into the next one, how and why human beings developed more complex ways of being organized. A mode of subsistence is how you get your food as a society. You can hunt it, you can grow it, and you can charge it on your credit card. Levels of political organizations are how power and hierarchy are organized in a society. Until about 10,000 years ago, the only type of political organization that existed in the world was what we call in anthropology a band. In our daily life English vocabulary, really a band is what you guys would call a tribe, a tribal organization. But there is a difference in anthropology between a band and a tribe, and we'll see each one of them. So the lowest level, the most simple level of political organization is called a band. It was the only way to be organized until 10,000 years ago. And still today, some small group on the planet live in bands, not a lot of them. Let's say there are about 200,000 individuals on the planet today. Bands are composed of nomadic people. They move from place to place because they are foragers. They hunt and gather. They're composed of few individuals. They have a very, very low population density on the territory, and bands have a very low population, from we say about 30 individuals to some 100. Below 30, it's not viable. The band cannot reproduce. Even if bands always exist in network, you need to be at least 30 individuals, so it's viable to have babies. To some 100, I would say more than 200 individuals, trouble starts. Some people try to seek a little bit of hierarchy. There is an incipient, maybe, competition there. So small population. And very important, there are few conflicts in bands. And I will talk a lot about conflict in this PowerPoint because it's an important trigger of complexity in human beings. So few conflicts between bands because they had huge territories, and they still have huge territories. They have a very low population density, and also few conflicts inside bands. It's peaceful. Of course, it's human beings. There are in bands a few individual dislikes. I don't like your face. Don't you look at my sister like that? But these are very small scale conflicts, and they don't last. They don't get organized into large scale conflicts. Very important, bands are what we call egalitarian. It means there is no permanent leader in a band. Now, it is kind of impossible to have very strictly only egalitarian organizations. We don't have two human beings that are the same. People have their skills and personalities. So when we mean that a band is or was egalitarian, it means that no one can take leadership and keep it. Of course, some men and some women have a pretty good status in bands. They gain respect and influence in their lives. So, for example, there's a big hunt, a big and dangerous hunt to be organized. There's this older man with a lot of experience, still in a good shape physically, so he will become naturally the leader of the hunt. But when the hunt is over, this man won't be more important than other people in the band. Same thing for women. Some of them might gain respect and importance throughout their lives because they know things. They know how to cure people, how they know how to settle disputes, or they know things. Um, but when their need, maybe in times of crisis, there's not an epidemic, but didn't exist in bands, but there's something going on. There's an insect, a rash or something, and she knows how to cure that. She will gain respect. But when the crisis is over, she'll come back to be herself again. So respect exists, and people have some sort of leadership, but this leadership dies with the individuals, or dies when it's not needed anymore. This leadership, this what I would call status, is not transmitted to the next generation. In bands, status is strictly achieved. You earn it in your life. You work hard for it, and you deserve it. Bands are typically associated with foraging. Foraging is a mode of subsistence. It's a way to get food. It means hunting, gathering. Now it might be a little bit more complex than that, but let's say bands are composed of foragers, of hunter-gatherers, nomadic. There is a gender division of labor in bands. So, well, typically men hunt and women gather, but it might be more complex than that, but let's keep it like that for now. Men are hunters, women gatherers. There is no economic specialization. This is important. What I mean here, I mean that everyone, every single adult in a band does the same thing. In the small scale society, every woman will collect food, take care of kids, maybe make some baskets, collect firewood, etc. Every man will be responsible of crafting, weapons and tools and go hunting. And every adult is responsible of finding food for themselves and the rest of the band. There is what we call reciprocity. Everyone is responsible for everyone else. Food is equally shared in a band. So there's no one that gets more status than the other person because he gets more food. So this is what I mean here. There's no profession. Profession. So everyone does the same thing, and this thing is what I mentioned, finding food and crafting tools and etc. Private property in a band is not important. You don't accumulate private property. Well, first you have to move with it. You're nomadic. It's not convenient. And it's not well accepted to own more things than other people. So what you own really is your clothes, your weapons to hunt, your tools, maybe your ornaments, and that's it. People don't have things, do not accumulate wealth. There are not a lot of foraging populations today in the world. We find them in 3 zones. Those who are strictly foragers. In the Amazonian forest in Brazil, at the very center of Africa, in Central African Republic, some groups still there hunt and gather, and in Australia, Aboriginal populations. Now, don't think that all Aboriginals in Australia hunt and gather. A very tiny fraction of them do that. The rest of them go to university, drive SUVs, and are totally integrated in the cash economy and in the global world. Those populations who still hunt and gather to survive, they choose it. They know very well about the outside world, but it's a good life to be a hunter-gatherer, and they don't want to stop it. They want to stay like that. That's mainly a choice. These are examples of human populations who choose to stay hunter-gatherers in some small-scale communities. The Inuit, for example, they're not all hunter-gatherers. Only a tiny fraction of them still are, and it's a choice. On the right, you see Aka populations in Central Africa. Same thing for them. But until 10,000 years ago, foraging was the only way of subsisting on Earth. People did not have more complex modes of subsistence. They used very simple tools. They used very simple social and political organizations. But at one point, things have changed. And this happened to make a very big round number, about 10,000 years ago with the end of the Ice Age. There are many theories to explain why people stopped at one point, not everywhere, but at some places, being hunter-gatherers and developed more complex modes of subsistence. These theories, I will not explain them here. It's not my goal. I chose one theory to explain. It's a well-accepted theory in the scientific community now. That's one reason why I chose it. It's very and simple theory, and it's recent, and it's Canadian. Brian Hayden is a professor at UBC. So this is one theory to explain why hunter-gatherers changed their way of life at some places. Hunter-gatherers, they prefer hunting big animals. They have all sorts of animals around, but they prefer big species. We call them K species in anthropology because they're big. So you don't work so long and you have more meat. And it kind of looks better as well when you come back to the camp with the big moose or mammoth or kangaroo, and it's better than having a bunch of small turtles or porcupines. So it's more sexy. So hunters, this is what they like. A lot of meat, big animals, a lot of fat, animal fat to feed all the camp. That's normal. We're the same. We want to work less for more money. So they were the same. That's totally normal. But at the end of the Ice Age, things changed in the environment. There was a big climate change around. This one was not triggered by human activity. It was a natural one. The climate became warmer and more humid as well at most places on Earth. So the biomass increased. There were more plants around to feed the animals. So there were more animals around to feed humans. And there were more humans around. We're thousands of years ago. There's no birth control. And when life is good, when there's a lot of things to hunt and gather, well, the population will rise. It's a natural process. Making babies is a fun activity and was a fun activity, so human beings make babies whenever possible. So there was this population rise in humans, so humans naturally wanted to hunt more, so they improved their hunting technology. And we see that in archaeological digs. They invented more efficient arrows, and bows and arrows and spear throwers and nets and traps and fish hooks, and they invented all sorts of things to be better hunters, better foragers, and they succeeded. It worked. So K species are big animals with a very slow reproductive rate. Think of a moose, and they got overexploited at this point, at the end of the Ice Age, because there were a lot of hunters around. Not a lot, like we have a big human population today, but more of them with good tools, efficient hunting technology. So these big K species were overexploited. And they were specifically these animal species for which you had to be very nomadic, because these K species, these big animals, migrate on the territory. So what people did at this point, they started exploiting smaller prey or species. Examples, depending on where you are in the world, now squirrels, fish, lizards, rodents. These are small prey, easier to catch. You don't have to go so far to catch them. They're omnipresent, pretty much everywhere. So naturally, this transition to hunting our species led to a reduction of mobility on the territory. People became less mobile because they did not have to be so mobile anymore. They didn't have these big transhumant animals to hunt. Um, so people became less mobile, stayed more time at the same spot in the same camp, many months maybe at once. So they they kind of exploited local resources much more and much more efficiently. And slowly, this led naturally to what we call food production. At one point, it became easier to grow your food on the spot than to go hunt it and collect it further all the time. Uh, it's very easy to know how to cultivate plants and raise animals. People knew about the reproductive cycle of animals before they domesticated them. People knew very early that if you plant a seed, it will grow, in next spring or next rainy season. But they didn't want to do it. That's time consuming. It's risky as well at the beginning. But at what point they had to do it? They had to start complementing their hunting gathering with a little bit of food production, planting, harvesting, maybe keeping animals close to them. That was the very first steps in the process of domestication of plants and animals, of food production. It did not happen overnight. It did not happen in 1, 2, or 3 generations. It took time. It took centuries at some places, and it took millennia at other places. So human beings entered at some places in the world. I'll explain where later. They started a transition to a new way of life. And in the case of political organizations, this transition is called tribal organizations. In tribes, people are not totally sedentary yet, year-round, but they're much less mobile. They might stay almost a full year at the same place, but still they will move. They will be maybe transhumant. They will move from place to place throughout the year and come back at the same place, at the same camp, at the same time of the year. They have a higher population, a few hundred to a few thousand, and still there's not a lot of conflicts between and inside tribes, but competition now is a new reality. People will be in competition for many reasons. I'm not talking about expansionist conflict to gain territory, not now. But they are in competition to be better, maybe horticulturalists, and they have bigger gardens, they have more animals, they're more skilled, and they have more children and a bigger lineage, and this kind of competition. So there's no large-scale conflict, but there's something, in a transition to it. Tribes are in transition also to a more complex social organization. They have an emerging political power. There's no well-organized, complex hierarchy yet, but there is some sort of political power that is emerging, and we call these societies not egalitarian anymore, not complex yet, but trans-egalitarian, in a transition. They don't have what we can call chiefs. In anthropology, we call their leaders headmen. So they are generally men, hardworking. They're skilled at some important things. They're generous. They share food with the community. They're good at settling disputes between families. They give good example. They're good men for the community. So naturally, they become leaders. And they have now some sort of private property around. Depending on the society, this private property now can be food, dried cereals or vegetables, and from the garden. It can be animals. If you're herders, I will talk about that later. A good example of a tribal organization is the Maasai people in Africa, in Tanzania, and around. These are herders. They have cattle. They have this private properties, their animals. They're almost totally sedentary, but men still have to travel around with their animals. And they have important leaders. They are above other people in society. The picture on the left shows you a bride in the Maasai community. So she's an important girl. You look at her, how she's dressed. She's the daughter of a very important man. So they have this kind of emerging social hierarchy. Tribes mean transition. Tribe starts with letter T, as in transition. Remember it like that. Tribes are typically associated as a mode of subsistence with horticulture or pastoralism. Horticulture means cultivating food in small gardens. You don't have extensive fields and deforestation yet. No, it's small scale gardens. It's complemented still by hunting and by gathering, but it's the start. It is a transition from foraging to agriculture. Private property, as I said, is now not of tremendous importance, but it appears now. There is this new notion around of material value, and this first value you have is your plot of land and what you grow in it. Pastoralism means herding of domesticated animals. This is associated with tribes, and it's less frequent. It was less frequent in the past than horticulture, but it happened, especially in regions that are not suitable for cultivation. They're not fertile for many reasons. Either it's too high in altitude, it's too dry, it's too cold, etc. Private property, as in the case of horticulture, it's now a reality, but now instead of being your patch of land and your vegetables or grain, now your private property is your animals. So there's this new notion again here of material value. Maybe we don't talk about wealth yet, but there's something that belongs to you. Many societies live from horticulture today in Central America, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. These are warm places where the land is very good for cultivation. And of course, in all countries where people live from horticulture, they have industrial agriculture, as we know here, but some populations still remain traditional and have this more simple mode of subsistence. And there are some pastoralist populations on Earth today, mainly in the Andes in South America. The Andes are this big mountain range. People herd llamas and alpacas there. In Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Sahel region in South Africa, there's a lot of herders. They have cattle mostly, and also sheep and goat. In the Arabic Peninsula, the camel is very important in subsistence. In North Europe, reindeer is an animal that is of tremendous importance for modern pastoralists, and horses in Central Asia. I chose this last example to illustrate a little bit, an example of lives of herders today. In Mongolia, large populations live with pastoralism and with their herds of horses, and we see it as a pretty simple mode of life, but they're very well organized. They live in these round houses. I'm sure you have seen them before. They're called ger in English, G-E-R, and in French is yourte. These are very easy to dismantle and put together. Half hour you're done with your house, you go away. They are still transhumant. They are not sedentary. but they have a lot of comfort in these houses. It's very, very comfortable to live there. It's warm. They have their stove there. They have their solar panels typically for electricity. They have their dish for HBO or whatever is the equivalent in Mongolia. They collect rainwater. It doesn't rain so much, but it's possible to collect rainwater. You drink also horse milk. And that's a way of life that is people love. They're not cut from the civilization. Don't think that they live in the wild and they don't know anything about the modern world. No, they know very well. They have their cell phone plan. They are partially integrated into cash economy. They're on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever you're using as a social media. And some of them go to college in the city and they come back after. So this is a way of life that they want to preserve as their heritage. But the problem now is that the government of Mongolia is selling a lot of this land, and they need a big land for their horses. But the land is being sold to mining companies for Mongolian companies and foreign companies as well. There are Canadian mines there, and herders are forced in some places to leave their land and to go live in cities, and they do not want it. They're not used to it, and they don't want to quit their nomadic and semi-nomadic way of life. There is a very high rate of depression and suicide in herders forced to be integrated, totally integrated in the job economy in cities. So we have seen that bands as political organizations typically practice foraging as a mode of subsistence. Tribes are in a transition. They will practice horticulture or pastoralism. And horticulture really is a transition to something. It is a transition to agriculture. Agriculture, you know what it means. It's growing domesticated crops and having domesticated animals. Now I'm talking about traditional agriculture, not the industrial agriculture. We know what came first, traditional agriculture. Animal energy is important for agriculturalist population. Now you have these powerful machines. You have horses and bulls. You can become a very efficient farmer with that. You have more technology as well, plows, irrigation, etc. Agriculture really started developing 10,000 years ago at some places on Earth only. We'll explain where later. But it's a natural process that started with horticulture. Important notions that come with agriculture. The notion of surplus, that's an important word. For the first time in human history, or I should say here prehistory, you can have a surplus of food that you can store for later, for hard times. This did not exist before. Foragers, horticulturalists, they really live a day-to-day life. Private property now becomes extremely important for farmers. You have your land, your house, your wealth even sometimes. Things can be first exchanged, and then they can be bought and sold. It's the open door to market economy. Market economy didn't start immediately with agriculture at the same time and currencies and everything. But now the door is open to that. There's a new notion of exchange, of buying things, of accumulating things. And agriculture was not developed everywhere in the world. It was developed only at a few places where the environment was more suitable for it. And what really is agriculture? It's first the domestication of plants. You domesticate nature around. You domesticate the wild. You control nature. You control plants when you become a farmer. But the plants that were good for you to start controlling and planting and transforming were not distributed evenly on the planet. Some people in some places got more lucky because they had more good plants to domesticate around, and that's an important point. There are good candidates, good wild plants that are suitable for cultivation. First, they grow quick. They give their fruit and seeds quick. They have big seeds, and I'm talking about seeds here because really cereals and dry stuff, stuff you can dry or that dry naturally in nature, are the best candidates because you can store them for a long time. That's awesome. You can domesticate strawberries, but good luck keeping them for next year. It won't last. Um, so it you need plants that grow quick, that are nutritious, that have protein ideally, and that are tough, that can be dried and stored for years ideally. And these plants, these good candidates, are wild cereals. Where on the planet were these good plants that were available for domestication? Now, good plants exist everywhere because they have been the idea of that plant, and that plant itself has been exported all over the planet. For example, now we grow peanuts everywhere, but really peanuts come from South America. And until a few centuries ago, they were only growing in South America. So naturally, wild plants existed at one place. So what was available for North Americans to domesticate? Honestly, nothing. Look around you when you go hiking. There is no good plant here that grows naturally that is really suitable for domestication. Not a lot of things. In Central America, they had the ancestor of corn, wild corn. You'll see on the picture later how it looks like. That's crazy hard to domesticate that. It was hard. Not much in South America. They had quinoa, but that's also hard to domesticate, to farm. In Asia, rice was growing in a wild form, and that was pretty good. Millet in Africa, it was the only good wild cereal, and it was not so good. No wild cereals in Oceania and in the Middle East. It's the only place where very good cereals grew naturally, and these good cereals for domestication were wild wheat and wild barley, and they almost look like modern ones. The job was done by nature before these plants were even domesticated. Some root plants were growing naturally on a wild state in different continents, and they were domesticated. For example, taro, Southeast Asia, yam in Africa, and potato in Native America, wild tomatoes as well, yucca. But these plants, they're good to eat. They provide a lot of starch and energy, but they're very hard to farm because you have to plant them. To plant the plant one by one, they're very hard to harvest, and you cannot keep them. You have to eat them now, otherwise they will rot. So they're not good plants to build empires on, or to become very efficient farmers for the next levels of social development. This is the best plant that existed in the Americas for domestication, and it was domesticated. It is teosinte. It's the ancestor of corn. The wild version is big as a toothpick and has about 8 little seeds in it. Can you imagine the work prehistoric farmers did? The work of artificial selection and planting and harvesting and replanting the better plants to have bigger crops than next generation. It was crazy work, but they succeeded in domesticating corn. But they worked like hell. It was a lot of work for them. So in the Americas, people were not lucky in the wild resources they had, the wild plants they had around. They did not become very successful farmers there. Same situation in Africa. On the left picture, you see wild millet. This is the best cereal that was growing around in Africa. Can you imagine? It doesn't even look edible. So they succeeded in making domesticated millet, as you see on the right, but it took centuries of manipulation to do that. And it was why sub-Saharan Africans did not become very successful farmers before the introduction of plants from other continents. It's the same thing for animals. There are a lot of wild animals around everywhere on the planet, but not all of them are suitable candidates for domestication. Good candidates have to meet some criteria. First, they have to be big and grow quickly, ideally. If your kids grow quicker than your animals, you have to feed them. It's not worth farming these animals. Huh? Animals are meat. You want to eat them. Uh, Good wild animals that are suitable for domestication can go along with humans. They're gregarious, so they live in herds naturally. They have an hierarchy naturally as well. So if the farmer can become the leader of the pack, that's perfect. They're good farm animals. They need to be quiet. What I mean here, they need to not to be too nervous or too aggressive. For example, zebras, they look like wild horses, but they can't be domesticated. They're crazy animals. They're very aggressive. Deer are very good animals to eat. They're big, but they're too nervous. They won't stay in captivity. Same thing for carnivores. They're aggressive animals. Good candidates for domestication needs to be easy to feed. They need to be herbivores, so they're cheap to feed. If you have to feed animals meat, well, it's better you eat the meat yourself. So goat, sheep, wild goat, wild sheep, perfect. They eat grass and then you eat them. These are good farm animals. And a quality that is pretty rare in wild animals. They have to be able to breed in captivity. A lot of animals are very territorial. They won't breed in captivity. So you can catch them in the wild, you can tame them, you can keep them, but you won't get offspring from them. So it's not worth farming these animals. For example, pandas. They have a lot of criteria. They become big and they have a okay reproductive rate. They're pretty slow, but it's okay. They're cheap to feed. They feed bamboo. They go along with humans. They're not aggressive, but they won't breed in captivity. You know, to have pandas breeding in a zoo, that's an adventure. That's really hard. When I was living in Washington, D.C., they had two pandas at in the zoo at the time. And the pandas wouldn't breed, so they put a giant screen in the cage of the pandas, one male, one female, and they showed them pandas mating, panda porn, and it did work. They had a baby, but that's a tremendous investment of resources here. You won't do that. You know, you didn't do that in a farm. You wouldn't do that in a farm 5,000 years ago. So these animals that meet all these criteria are very rare in the wild. They were not very common when it was time to become farmers. The only good candidates that met these criteria in the Americas was the wild version of the llama and the alpaca, and these were domesticated. But they're not ideal farm animals, or they are not, you can ride them, they're not draft animals, so they provide good meat and good wool though, but that's it. And there was only one suitable wild animal in the Americas with all these criteria. Native Americans domesticated the bee, the turkey, the guinea pig, but these are, really small animals. It's not very convenient. In North Europe, there were wild reindeers and they were domesticated. In Asia, people domesticated wild horses. The only good, suitable animal in sub-Saharan Africa was the donkey, and it was domesticated, but there were no other wild candidates around. The perfect animals to domesticate, the very good ones, were present in the wild as a wild version only in the Middle East region. Wild cows, wild sheep, goat, pigs, and camels. So it's again here, people from the Middle East were super lucky geographically with the wild species available to them around to become farmers. So farming developed more or less quickly, depending on where people were on the planet, depending on the wild resources available to them, but it did develop independently at many places. In North America, around the Mississippi Valley, in Central America, in South America, in a few places, in the Andes, in the Amazonian basin, in the Sahel region of Africa, in the Middle East first, in Asia, in Papua New Guinea as well. So yes, farming developed, people became farmers. And farming was probably the most important social innovation in human history, or here I should say prehistory. I asked in the class what were the most important innovations or inventions of human history, and I had a lot of interesting answers. Among them, or a lot of them, metals, writing, democracy, political systems, hierarchies, religions, the wheel, the printing press, the light bulb, a lot of things. And all these things would not exist without the development of agriculture. So we'll see a few direct consequences of agriculture. Now I'm not talking about democracy and the internet or electricity. I'm talking about direct, immediate consequences. First, a growth in population. Population growth is both one of the triggers and one of the consequences of the development of agriculture. Another consequence, people stopped being nomadic. They became sedentary, settled life. People started living in permanent villages. Now you have your place to live. Now you have granaries to accumulate food. You have houses. I'm not talking about urbanism yet, but village life, sedentary life. Third consequence, transformation of the landscape. Example, as you have here on the picture, terracing mountains. You need a lot of social organization to do that, huh? And this became possible because of agriculture, and it became needed as well in some areas of the world. Irrigation was also a very important transformation of the landscape that happened after agriculture. Irrigation was important for farming, of course, but it became important for the development of social hierarchies, because when you control water, to a certain extent, you control people. Also, deforestation is a major consequence of agriculture. You clear the forest to make fields, and this is why once a population becomes agriculturalists, after a few generations, there's no turning back. Not because they don't know how to hunt and gather anymore, because they destroyed the natural habitat of wild animals. So that's an important consequence. Consequence number 4, change in the division of labor. The division of labor existed before agriculture. It was mostly a gender division of labor. Men had their roles in society and women had their roles, but everyone was responsible of finding food, as I explained earlier. Now things change with agriculture. The gender division of labor did not disappear. We still live with a gender division of labor today. But a new division of labor started to exist because in a farming community, even with traditional farming, not everyone in the population needs to be a farmer. Some people, first a tiny fragment of the population, but as agricultural techniques developed, a more important fraction of the population became freed from food production. Let's say more than half of people do not farm because those who farm are efficient enough to feed everyone. So what these people do if they do not farm, they do something else. They develop professions. They become architects, bricklayers, ritual specialists like priests. They become traders. They become potters, metallurgists, weavers, tailors, blacksmith. All these emerging professions really only could start with agriculture. And kids were put to work as well in early agricultural societies, unlike in foraging societies. Consequence number 5 is linked with the fourth one. If some people are freed from the burden of food production in a community because the rest of the population is efficient enough, farming is more efficient than hunting as a food production strategy, these people who do not farm can use their brain to develop new technologies. They make inventions. They have time to devote for that. So these great inventions, the wheel, pottery, these early great inventions, these engineering technologies, a pulley and lever, metals, metallurgy, smelting, ore to make metals. That's super important. Weaving did not exist before agriculture because people had nothing to weave with. You need wool and cotton and fiber for that. And weaving is not only to make clothes, it's useful to make sails to go conquer the world. So agriculture led to tremendous technological developments. Consequence number 6, new kinds of interactions between communities. Communities did interact before farming for help, for these bands and tribes existed in network because sometimes it was not viable inside the tribe or band. But with agriculture, really communities have a definite territory they live in. So maybe they need to trade with other communities. Trade became essential because now on your definite territory, you might not have all the resources you need. So you need to trade with other people. Not war, but conflict. Let's call it conflict. Large-scale conflict developed with agriculture. And we'll talk about that later in this presentation. Large-scale conflicts were kind of not needed in bands and tribes. People had a large territory, a scattered population, so conflicts were less frequent. But now with agriculture, conflicts arise because people need land. So conflict for land, conflict for resources. Before, conflicts might have existed for the rise of one's individual status or for spiritual reasons, capture prisoners but not now. Now it's conflicts for land, for resources. Agriculture also led to the development of new ideologies. Ideologies in human communities have always existed. And before agriculture, they have existed. Ideologies like spirituality. People believed in some spiritual world or some supernatural world. Before agriculture, we see that with burials, with offerings, with even people living in caves a long time ago had some sort of spirituality. They were drawing on the walls of the caves. But with agriculture, new ideologies emerged in human communities. New, I would call them organized religions that have new deities to pray, linked with fertility, not only human fertility, but agricultural fertility. So the rain, the sun, the plants themselves, farm animals in some communities became very important aspects of religious thoughts around, even maybe some important deities. What you see here on that drawing is a rollout of a drawing made on a ceramic vessel. It's from the place where I was digging in Peru. They're bean warriors. Don't ask me what being a bean warrior means, but they are beans and they are dressed as warriors with their shields and war clubs. When you dig a burial of a warrior in this Moche community, they're called the Moche, you find these paraphernalia, this clothing. So beans were important to worship somehow, because we do find gold ornaments in the burials of very important people in shape of beans, pumpkin seeds, peanuts, and all these kind of small seeds. They were important to venerate. They were important, maybe not gods, but important aspect of the local ideology. So new ideologies developed with farming, and not only that, for the first time, ideologies and the manipulation of the religious thought and the beliefs of people was used to dominate people, to rise one's status. We'll talk about that later on. Consequence number 8, positive and negative effects on health. The development of agriculture had some positive effects on the health of people, not because people were eating better, maybe not actually, but now there is a social hierarchy with agriculture. So those on top of the social hierarchy, yes, probably they were eating better, but the bulk of the population was probably not, and actually maybe have reduced their food variety. But now there is a stable food supply, so life is less risky maybe and less dangerous than a foraging life. Now you are sedentary as a farming community, so it's less dangerous. It's easier. It's easier for certain people in the population, for the elders. Can you imagine your grandparents being nomadic? I'm not sure about that. It was a nomadic way of life is really hard for older people. So farming was an easier way of life. It was also easier for people when they're injured or sick, or for pregnant women, for small children. All these categories of people had an easier life. So globally, the life expectancy maybe rose a little bit. This is an important point. Hunting is dangerous for adult men as well, much more than farming. So life was easier, life was less dangerous. But farming had a lot of negative effects on health, mostly because of infectious disease. There were other problems that started with farming. I don't know if you can see that. This is the upper teeth of a person I was digging a few years ago. So look at this person died pretty young, adult, because the wisdom teeth are there, but they're not so worn. So young adult here. Look at how worn the teeth are. They're broken with cavities. So dental health got really bad with farming because there's a lot of sugars and cereals and not a lot of hygiene around. But the most important effect on health was really infectious diseases, because now you are a farming community living in villages, maybe crowded villages, permanent villages, always on the same spot. So water may be contaminated around, so parasites, infections. You have granaries full of food, so you probably have rats around. The plague, it comes from rats. The Black Plagues in the Middle East, the Middle Ages, sorry. So these diseases come from people living close to some animals, also being close to farm animals. This brought diseases in human populations because farm animals get sick, and then when they live in close proximity with humans, their viruses undergo mutations so they can infect humans. So for example, measles is a cow's disease originally, but it adapted very well to humans. The flu is originally a disease of pigs and birds and domestic birds like chicken, but they also adapted to human beings really well to make them sick. So all these epidemics we have today would not exist if we did not develop farming. Other diseases as well, like Ebola. You have heard about Ebola a few years ago. Huh? It does not come from farm animals, it comes from wild animals. But wild animals living in close proximity to human beings, like bats, for example, it comes from bats. Because you destroy the wild habitat of bats, because you make fields for agriculture, then bats come and live close to you in your village, and then they make you sick. COVID comes from wild animals as well, but wild animals that would never live in close proximity with humans if humans were not farmers living in crowded conditions. So epidemics really started with agriculture. That's a negative effect on health, but paradoxically, it helped some populations later on, making some conquests. And the last, but very important consequence of agriculture, direct consequence, is the social organization that became more complex. The development of socio-political hierarchy, of chiefs, of people with power, of social authority. It developed with agriculture. It was not possible before because the power of the first chiefs was supported by their wealth, by their belongings. And these first belongings, it was food, it was grain, it was full granaries. So social hierarchy exists because of agriculture. It was not possible before. It was not well accepted before as well. The first people who decided they would become chiefs or permanent leaders, they had to be very persuasive to do that because the rest of the population did not want someone with a hierarchy above the head. So they used different strategies, the coercive strategies, they used force, maybe with a incipient standing army. Some of them used the ideological strategies, manipulating the beliefs around them. Some of them use the economic strategies, creating debt in the population. So all these strategies were possible because of a food surplus. Now we have talked a lot about agriculture as a new mode of subsistence that developed in some places in the world. And this new mode of subsistence is typically associated with a new kind of political organization, as we have just seen. Now there's a complex social hierarchy around that is possible with agriculture, and this means people could develop chiefdoms with agriculture. So a chiefdom is a form of complex political organization with at least one village, but most of the time many of them, under the authority of a chief. And this chief is recognized as such by the population, and it is now an official title that can be transmitted to the descendants. So the status now is not only achieved during life, it can be ascribed to a person. In a chiefdom, private property is very important. Your first private property is the food you have, the animals you have, but very quick it became the wealth you could accumulate by exchanging this food, by having allies as a chief, etc. Conflicts are very frequent in chiefdoms, were in the past very frequent in chiefdoms. Not anymore, we'll see that, but chiefdoms got more complex because of conflict actually. In a chiefdom, work is highly specialized. Not everyone is a food producer. A fraction of the community is a food producer, a farmer, and the rest of the community, as I mentioned earlier, can develop specializations, have time to do something else than farming. They're freed from food production, so they can develop all sorts of skills and new technological developments and develop professions. For example, as I said, blacksmith, weavers, potters, traders, architects, all developed because of farming. And again, in a chiefdom, there is a strong social hierarchy, well developed, with hereditary ranks. I can't talk about social classes yet, that's a very modern notion, but we call them ranks in anthropology, with the accumulation of wealth in the hands of few individuals. There are a lot of people on the planet right now living organized in chiefdoms. But you have to keep in mind that same thing as those organized in bands and tribes, they are citizens of modern countries. The whole planet is divided into many countries in modern states. There is no place that does not belong to a state. So these people organized in chiefdoms, they know very well about the broader world, but their immediate daily life is organized inside their village. Their loyalty goes to their local chief instead of going to their government, their official government of their country. And this can be for many reasons, because they live a very traditional way of life, because the government is corrupted, or because of internal conflicts in their countries, and because of poverty, many reasons. But people, when they are organized in chiefdoms, it's because, of course, they're citizens of a country, they can get a passport and travel, but their immediate identity is defined with their local people, their local chief, instead of their government. In the past, chiefdoms were very unstable political entities. I said not today because they're pretty stable. They are not expansionist anymore. But in the past, chiefdoms pretty quickly got more complex and turned into states. They developed to become states. So in our daily life vocabulary in English, we talk about civilizations and the highest form of political development. But in anthropology, we call that a state. That's the most complex form of political entity. There is something called a city-state. I will not talk about that in this course, but city-states existed in network to become a little bit, to cover a large territory. But what I will mention here is territorial states that developed directly from chiefdoms, and they were, and they still are, large, centralized political entities. States started to develop in situ, I mean in the spot alone, about 5,000 years ago. And then the idea spread with conquest and alliances. And today the whole planet is divided into modern states. We call them countries. But these early states I'm interested in here, developed independently at some places on the planet. We'll see where. And how do we define a state? An ancient state, a pristine state, or a modern state? It's the same definition. It's a large political entity. It's complex. It has many levels of government. It is centralized. A state has urbanism. It has large cities. On the picture here, it is a map of Tenochtitlan. Now Tenochtitlan is called Mexico City. But this city existed before the arrival of the Spanish. And it was already a very well-organized city with a central plaza and a grid plan. So even early states had their cities. So urbanism is an important component of states. Taxes and laws are also very important components of the organization of states. In every state, the central authority has to withdraw taxes in the population and to redistribute the product of this taxation unequally most of the time. What you have here on the drawing is one of the most ancient tax forms in the world. It's your T4 if you're Aztec. So the drawing shows the cities on the bottom of the pages, and on top of the pages, these were objects and goods that the citizens of these cities had to pay to the central Aztec state every year. It also has numbers on it. So taxes were already very important in ancient first states. Math, science, engineering, these are very important aspects of states, even the earliest states, because you have to count a lot of things. You have to count how many citizens you have in the states, the census. You have to count how many soldiers you have on the battlefield, how many animals you have on the farms of the government or the states, how many goods you withdraw with the taxes. You need to calculate, you need astronomy, you need to calendars, you need to count the days and the years for recording events, for organizing agriculture. This is done with calendars, with some knowledge of astronomy. Engineering is important for monumental architecture. Monumental architecture is an essential component of a state. Even the earliest states had their huge monuments, some of them secular, I mean non-religious, some of them religious, like the pyramids of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, first states, one of the first states in the world, already with a monumental architecture. And all states had some form of monumental architecture, and the main goal of it was not to house people. It was to show off. It was to show the power of the elite, show the power of the state. It is not a coincidence why during 9/11 these two towers you see on the right were precisely destroyed, because they were the most blatant symbol of the wealth of the state, of the economic power of the state. Writing was very important already in the earliest states, existed in nearly all of them, except one in South America. The Inca did not have writing, but they had at least a very precise notation system, the Quipu system, recording system. But writing was important for many reasons. For trade, this cuneiform tablet you see here on the picture was an essential component. It's a kind of prehistoric packing slip sent by traders in the state, those doing the long distance trade. So you see numbers here and letters showing what was in the shipment. But writing did not develop only because of trade. It developed for religion. Some states developed writing to record their religious facts and doctrines, to record the deeds of their kings and priests. Some other states, like in China, for example, developed writing for ideology, but more for divination in this case here. So early writings had a lot of uses. Long-distance trade is and was an essential component of states, internal trade and external trade, essential when you have a definite territory. And war. Now, not only large-scale conflict here, but real war with a standing army, with militarism, very important, even in the earliest states. So at some point in the development of human societies, chiefdoms rose their socio-political hierarchy, level of power, level of complexity, and became what we call states in anthropology. States are large political entities with a central government, as we have seen already. But how did it happen? What was the process? What were the incentives or the triggers of that? There are many theories to explain it. As I did with agriculture, I chose one to explain to you guys because it is the most accepted in the scientific community, and it applies to all places in the world where the state emerged independently. There are 6 places in the world where the state emerged independently, without copying the neighbor, without being conquered by anyone. These places are in the Old World: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley in today Pakistan, China, and in the New World, Mexico and the Andes, modern-day Peru. We'll see images of these places one by one. The first place where the state emerged independently is Mesopotamia. You know this already, the first civilization of the world. It happened in a fertile valley around the Tigris and Euphrates. These are 2 great rivers of Mesopotamia. You can see the green zone in the Google map image here. When the state emerged some 5,000 years ago, it was more green, more fertile, but now the climate became drier. But you can still see the green valley there, fertile, surrounded by other kinds of geological features, the Zagros Mountains east and the Syrian Desert west. The second place is the Nile Valley in Egypt. This is a very narrow, small, very long, but very narrow, very fertile valley. As you can see here on the picture, you can see the green area surrounded on east and west by the Sahara Desert and north by the sea. The third place is the Indus Valley in what is today Pakistan. You can see on the picture here again the green, fertile valley surrounded by deserts on both sides and the Himalaya mountains north. The last place where the state emerged independently in the old world is in China. It developed along the Yellow River Valley. I do not have a Google map, a Google satellite picture here, but I do have a map. You can see the river on the map, and it is surrounded by many desertic zones. In the Americas, the state emerged at 2 different places independently. The first one being in today's Mexico, in one small valley we call the Oaxaca Valley. This state, they were not the Aztecs, they were not the Maya, they were the Zapotec state. And the Oaxaca Valley, you have a picture here, it's a very fertile river valley, but really small and surrounded by very high mountains, the Sierra Madre. The last place was in Peru, in South America, on the north coast of Peru. You see the coast here on the picture. It is a desert, but it's crossed by many small, fertile valleys. West, you have the Pacific Ocean, and east, the Andes, the very high mountain range. These 6 places in the world have things in common that are important to consider before I explain the theory on the origins of the state. First, they are pretty warm zones, so the climate is favorable for a bigger population. There's a lot of food around. Second, they are fertile river valleys, so very good for agriculture. And third characteristic, and very important, they are circumscribed zones. This means that they are limited in space, these valleys, and they cannot be expanded beyond a certain limit imposed by the environment, by the geography. So the theory starts like this. It's not a complicated one. It's very easy. Imagine in these fertile valleys, thousands of years ago, a bunch of chiefdoms, people living in villages of agriculturalists under the authority of chiefs. And the climate is good, the crops are good, there's no disaster around, no disease and no drought, so things go well. So naturally, the population is going up, as it always happens in human communities before birth control, when there's food for everyone and there's no crisis around. When the population rises, naturally, farmers will develop new technologies to increase farming production. They will invent techniques for terracing, for irrigation, for better tools. They will expand their territory as much as they can. And then the population rises again because there's more food for everyone. And the same situation probably happens in all chiefdoms around in the same fertile valley, because the climate and the situation is the same everywhere in the valley. At one point, chiefdoms and chiefs in authority cannot expand the land anymore because all possible land was used for farming. So they really have to do something to feed the growing population. They cannot go away, they cannot move away, because all the territory is occupied already by people. Remember, these are circumscribed zones, they are limited territories. So the best option here, the only left option, is to fight the neighboring chiefdom, is to gain the neighbor's land, because you cannot expand yours. So conflicts rose in these chiefdoms. And when you dig an archaeological site in one of these 6 zones of the world, and you dig chiefdoms and villages, you see things like palisades for protection, burnt villages, burials of sacrificed or killed war prisoners. We see these things in digs. So this really happened in these places in the world. But there is still a problem even with the fighting the neighboring chiefdom to conquer the territory, because the conflict, and this is also visible in archaeology, the conflicts between chiefdoms did not result in a lower population to feed. There was no mass extermination of people. We do not find mass burials of people who were killed in battle or after battle. So no, there is still a big population to feed, but there's no bigger land for everyone in the valley. So there's nowhere to escape. There's nowhere to expand farming. So even if one chiefdom wins the battle, the population is still high to feed. So naturally, some people in the valley will not eat enough eventually. So winners of the conflict, the chiefdom that wins, will see the status of its inhabitants rise because they won the battle. They expand their authority. They get more food because they can steal or integrate the land of the neighbors. And those who lose the conflict have nowhere to escape. So they lose their land, they lose their status, and they become subjected. They become under the authority of the winning chiefdoms. So they are the ones who will not have a good access to food anymore. They are the ones who are going to go to bed hungry every night. So as battles happen between chiefdoms, the winning one kind of swallows, integrates the losing one to become a bigger political entity. But bigger political entity and more complex, with those people having a very high status and some people having a lower status. So chiefdoms become less numerous, but they become bigger because they integrate lands and they become more powerful. And the process does not stop at the first battle. The process will continue and continue until the formation of a huge chiefdom, very, very complex, that we call a territorial state. So this is the natural process of the birth of the state, this big and complex political entity. It's by the succession of fights, of conflicts between chiefdoms. So there is no state before the development of a productive agriculture centuries before. and even millennia before. So states emerged at some places in the world, but not everywhere where agriculture was adopted. To see the formation of complex chiefdoms and then states, a territory needs a very productive agriculture. So some zones in the world, some early states had amazing advantages over other zones where the agriculture and chiefdoms and even some states were developed. And these places, these early states, were the ones located around the axis, the east-west axis between the Middle East and Europe. Remember, the Middle East is where nearly all good, suitable wild resources were pooled by coincidence. Wild cereals, wild animals. So these people became the most productive farmers of the world, and pretty quick. But the climate changed in the Middle East, in this zone, after agriculture was developed. It became drier. It became warmer as well. Whereas in Europe, the climate got more favorable for agriculture. So the idea of productive farming traveled on an east-west axis between the Middle East and Europe, because Europe became, after, the best zone with the climate. And not only the idea of farming traveled, but the crops as well. Cereals and animals traveled very quick to Europe. Europeans borrowed these crops. So at one point, by copying or by getting the ideas and the crops from the Middle East, Europe developed very quickly. They ended up having a very high population density, and going along with that, easy contact between communities and a lot of trade between materials, between peoples and ideas, because what is traded in a trade network, in an exchange network? It's goods, it's food, it's material, it's people, but it's ideas as well, ideas of new technologies, of new developments. So east-west axis is always good for trade of ideas and people, because it's a similar climate. And the axis between the Middle East and Europe is an east-west axis. Whereas a northwest axis is not very good for trade of ideas and crops and people, because you have to cross many climatic zones. So it's always slower. Things travel slower on a north-south axis. So a very productive agriculture in this zone of the world thousands of years ago triggered high population, easy contact of population, easy trade of materials. So it was already a favorable zone in Europe at that point. So since in Europe and the Middle East, people had a very long history of productive agriculture, they also had a very long history of technological development, because this goes together. As I said already, in a productive farming community, not everyone farms. A lot of people have their brains free to invent great things and to develop things. So metallurgy was developed. Weaponry, because it goes together, armors, transportation was developed, navigation was developed at a very high point in Europe. And this is all thanks to the very productive agriculture. And with farming, you have farm animals like horses and bulls. So these farm animals that were present and thriving in Europe gave a lot of advantages to European populations. First, for subsistence, because you eat these animals. Then for transportation, because they're strong. They were used as work animals on farms. They are very powerful machines. And they were used for war, for conquests. So animal force, these farm animals, were extremely important and gave great advantages to Europeans. They did not exist elsewhere in the world. They did not exist in Africa. They did not exist in the Americas. They existed in Europe, because nature placed them in the Middle East and Europe on an east-west axis first. And if a population spends a lot of time in close contact with farm animals, they have all sorts of diseases, and these viruses, these infectious diseases, become endemic in the population. Endemic is the opposite of epidemic. It becomes uh, spread everywhere, and people develop a high resistance to these diseases. So not only Europeans had technology, productive farming, high population, they had powerful animals with them, but they were also highly resistant to infectious disease, to a lot of viruses because of that. And this helped them a lot. All these characteristics Europeans had uh, gave them a very big advantage in conquering other populations. And this is part of the explanation why Europeans conquered the world and not the opposite, even if all populations had the same level of intelligence.